The US currently has the most powerful military in the world. Not only is it ahead of its peers in terms of tech, but also in numbers. If the US Air Force was its own nation, it would have the second most powerful Air Force in the world, behind the US as a whole, but still more powerful than China or Russia. But statistics don't always matter in war, raising the question, could the full might of the US military be enough to invade China? Tackling the issue of invading China means taking a sober look at geography and logistics. Of all the militaries in the world, the United States is best suited for the task of moving large amounts of troops long distances. In fact, it's the only military in the world capable of doing so. This is a matter of necessity. The US has always been an ocean away from any potential conflict, and during the Cold War, the fate of Europe depended entirely on the US's ability to rapidly mobilize and move huge amounts of equipment and personnel across the Atlantic. The US's geography is both a blessing and a curse. In terms of defense, it's a blessing, the likes of which no other major power enjoys. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans are vast buffers between America and any potential invader, and an invasion force is never more vulnerable than when it's in transit. This is the reason why the US operates the most powerful and flexible navy in the world, and why no power, or combination of powers, could successfully invade the United States. In our US versus the world video, we highlighted how even if the entire world worked together, it couldn't pull off an invasion of the American homeland. And the main reason was because of a lack of logistics. All of the world's tanks, troops, and fighter jets don't mean a thing if you can't get them across the ocean. And few powers on Earth have any meaningful capability to move equipment long distances. But America's ocean buffers are also a curse, because its own military forces must cross long distances in order to go into action against an adversary. Even with the best logistics in the world, and not even a shadow of second-place competition, the US still took nearly half a year to move enough firepower to Saudi Arabia for Desert Storm. In a true crisis such as a war in Europe, NATO couldn't count on heavy US ground support for at least a month after hostilities began, an eternity in modern high-speed warfare. This severely complicates an invasion of the Chinese mainland. First, American forces will need to secure a staging area for an invasion. This will need to be a place close to the Chinese mainland that can be kept secure from enemy attack, allow for the concentration of forces for the initial invasion, and allow for the transition of follow-on forces and supplies. The most obvious candidates are the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan, but the best candidate would be South Korea due to its geographic proximity. Even better would be Taiwan, as both the Philippines and Japan are still a significant distance from China and would increase the distances ships need to travel to deliver troops, turn around, load up with fresh ones, and return. Given that any invasion forces would be going up against 118 Chinese infantry divisions and 13 armored divisions, about 1.5 million personnel, turnaround time to bring in fresh troops and equipment would be critical. Whether South Korea or Taiwan, though, the US would first have to secure its staging area, and that would not be simple. In this scenario, let's assume complete cooperation by a host country. The US would still have to weather multiple waves of Chinese attacks against its staging areas. The first would come in the form of the People's Liberation Army rocket forces, which fields 2,200 ballistic and cruise missiles, some of which can strike targets as far out as Guam and Hawaii. Currently, the US operates about 200 vessels in the Pacific, and the Chinese have enough anti-ship missiles to overwhelm every single US vessel's missile defenses. Meanwhile, ballistic missiles would crater runways across the Pacific, from Hawaii to Guam to any friendly nations lending their facilities to America, such as Japan and the Philippines. Runways can be repaired, but even hardened aircraft shelters, of which the US has few despite years of warnings to Congress, can still be destroyed by missile attack. In recent war games, the US saw as much as 90% of its pre-positioned aircraft destroyed on the ground, with losses amounting to nearly $1 billion in hardware. However, these war games didn't take the full capabilities of the US into account, and it's certain that in the case of war, electronic and kinetic attacks against Chinese satellites and other kill chain assets would reduce the effectiveness of the missile phase of the war. What's not up for debate, though, is that China would still inflict significant damage to the US, especially in a bolt-out-of-the-blue attack. As both nations' counterforce capabilities are so great, both nations are incentivized to be the one to strike first, and whoever does will gain an immediate, significant advantage over the other. After weathering the missile storm, the real air war would begin. As US forces moved to staging areas, the Air Force and Navy would be engaged in a protracted battle against the Chinese Air Forces. Here too, China has the advantage. Despite fielding a clearly superior Air Force, China has the advantage of mass. Except for any surviving pre-positioned forces, every single U.S. plane that joins the fight must be flown in from somewhere else. This means pulling combat planes from Europe, the Middle East, and the homeland, and flying them to airfields which will still be under missile attack for weeks after the start of the war. Meanwhile, China's entire air force can be concentrated against any American air attack or defense. U.S. tech might be superior, but numbers matter a great deal, especially when American stealth aircraft are limited to only 8 long-range AIM-120s and 2 short-range AIM-9s. With the exception of the J-20, the rest of the Chinese fleet is made up of 4th-generation aircraft or worse, but they can carry many more missiles compared to their American counterparts. And China's PL-15 air-to-air missile has a longer range than currently fielded American AIM-120s, meaning its non-stealth platforms have an advantage over the significant number of 4th-gen aircraft that America still operates. Initially, the U.S. would be forced into a defensive air war as it tries to beat back huge waves of Chinese fighters supporting long-range attack aircraft, like the Xi'an H-6. Armed with standoff attack weapons, Chinese H-6s could deliver precision strike capabilities well outside the range of U.S. air defenses. American stealth fighters would inevitably take a toll on these bombers, but to do so, they would have to prioritize them over their escort fighters and leave themselves vulnerable to counterattack. Despite stealth capabilities, U.S. losses of F-22s and F-35s would be high, and unlike the F-35, F-22s lost in combat are not going to be replaced as the production lines to make them have been closed a long time ago. The U.S. would be forced to fight the first few weeks of the air war in much the same way that Russia today fights an air war, under a fortress air fleet doctrine, with aircraft being used to supplement ground air defenses. This is something that the highly aggressive U.S. Air Force is unaccustomed to, but in this scenario, it would become a strategic necessity. However, Chinese losses would still be significant as they fly into the teeth of U.S. air defenses. And as more and more air assets are quickly moved into the Pacific, the balance of power would gradually begin to favor the U.S. Once a critical mass of air power was achieved, the ground bases start being secured against air and missile attack. The U.S. could then launch its own offensive air operations against China. The emphasis would be on carrying out SEAD, or suppression of enemy air defenses operations that target Chinese ground-based air defense batteries, radars, fighter bases, and fighter aircraft themselves. This is a mission that the U.S. is very good at, having specially trained pilots and specially modified aircraft to perform this exact role. The focus would be on carving out a bubble of air superiority over landing zones on the Chinese mainland and allowing access to long-range strike aircraft who would then move on to the task of complicating a Chinese ground response to an invasion. The best aircraft for the role would be the small fleet of B-2s, which would be able to penetrate deep into Chinese air defenses in order to target command and control, communications, and logistics networks deep inside China with the help of standoff weapons. Aircraft like the B-1, the B-52 would be critical as well, but extremely vulnerable and require weeks of air campaign to establish air superiority before they could be safely brought near the fight. However, with the use of standoff weapons, these bombers would be the real hammer against Chinese forces. While the B-2 is relegated to its original purpose of pinpoint surgical strikes against very high-value targets, inevitably the B-2 fleet would be attrited to the point of combat ineffectiveness, and like the F-22, no new B-2s are being built to replace combat losses. The Navy, meanwhile, would be tasked with sweeping the oceans clear of the People's Liberation Navy. Before a single ship could begin to deliver troops to Chinese shores, the Navy would need to destroy every single surface combat vessel and China's fleet of submarines, or at the very least, force them to remain in port. Even a single sub could wreak havoc on U.S. amphibious assault ships, which is why it's lucky that Chinese subs are notoriously noisy and easy to track. The real star of the show would be the U.S.'s own submarine fleet, which is superior to China's and would wreak havoc on China's surface vessels. But if an invasion were to take place across the Taiwan Strait, both sides' submarines would have limited use in the actual strait itself due to its shallow depth, making them vulnerable to detection. Destroying the Chinese Navy would be a complicated task, but one that the U.S. is well suited for. China has the largest navy in the world today, with 730 total ships versus the U.S.'s 484. However, only a portion of either side's numbers are actual combat vessels, the other being special purpose or logistical vessels. In terms of combat power, the U.S. Navy punches well above the Chinese Navy, with 11 supercarriers versus the 2 regular carriers that China has deployed. The U.S. also operates nearly twice as many destroyers, fielding 92 versus China's 50. Of special importance would be America's amphibious assault ships, in essence mini aircraft carriers designed to land troops ashore and support them directly. Here the US operates 9, each of which is larger than China's 3. China operates a large number of smaller vessels, such as 43 frigates against 0 American counterparts and 72 corvettes against America's 22. This gives the Chinese Navy a degree of flexibility over the US, but still means that in terms of battle force missiles or the number of direct action missiles for ships to use toward land targets, ship-to-ship, and air defense, the US outnumbers China by approximately 2-1. However, these missiles are concentrated on a smaller number of larger vessels, which could end up being a liability if the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force is especially good at its job at the start of the war and turns many American ships into artificial reefs during the first days of the combat. The naval war would take weeks of buildup as the US surges additional vessels into the combat theater. The presence of US allies in the fight would help significantly, especially if Japan and South Korea joined the fight. But the biggest hurdle for aggressor forces is the simple fact that China is enjoying home field advantage. Aggressor forces would need to coordinate surface action with air action, and air assets would need to fly from hundreds of miles away to support the troops on the front line. China, meanwhile, would only need to fly dozens of miles to reach the front line. To facilitate offensive operations, the US would by necessity have to strike at Chinese bases on the mainland, with stealth aircraft, standoff attack weapons, and land attack missiles fired from submarines close to Chinese shores. The ace in America's sleeve here is its Rapid Dragon missile system, a palletized weapons module. Rapid Dragon is essentially a big box full of long-range cruise missiles which can be dropped out the back of an unmodified cargo aircraft. Each pallet is normally dropped out in aircraft such as a C-17 or C-130 and can be fitted with between 4 to 45 cruise missiles, with ranges up to 575 miles. Once the JASSM XR variant is available in large numbers around 2024, these ranges will go up to 1,200 miles. Rapid Dragon is a truly terrifying proposition for Chinese forces, and there's no comparable capability anywhere in the world. The US has 13,300 aircraft, absolutely dwarfing Chinese air forces, which number at 3,284. Of these, nearly 1,000 air cargo aircraft, which could be fitted with the Rapid Dragon system. The name is no accident either, making it clear who the US developed this capability for. With such firepower, the US would inevitably win the war for China's skies and seas. But the invasion is not a guaranteed success. Each American amphibious assault ship can carry 1,870 troops, with 3 large landing craft, 2 smaller landing crafts or LCUs, or alternatively, 39 amphibious assault vehicles or 140 wheeled vehicles. Each Wasp-class amphibious assault ship can carry only 5 tanks though, with the newer American-class ships having no well deck in exchange for a larger capacity for air operations. In an absolute best-case scenario, US forces could hope to put 4,000 to 5,000 troops on the ground in each wave, supported by 24 or so tanks, a few dozen lighter combat vehicles, and a similar complement of artillery. This is where proximity is critical for landing operations, as the further away that the invasion staging grounds are, the longer the return trip would be. And this could leave the initial landing force supported only by air and naval bombardment for a day or more. A dicey proposition given the nearly 1.5 million combat troops China fields. This massive combat power, however, cannot be concentrated on a single or even multiple landing beaches. The logistics of such a task are impossible, but it also would leave these forces extremely vulnerable to air attack and ship-to-shore bombardment. A long-term air and naval bombardment campaign lasting perhaps as much as 6 months could see the US attain air dominance at an incredibly high cost and put Chinese response forces at extreme threat. But with only a few thousand troops being landed in each assault wave, the math is firmly on China's side. Even if by some miracle a successful beachhead is established, American forces would have to contend with the millions of reservists that China could press into service at the moment an invasion seemed likely. Given how long it would take to secure air dominance, exhaust Chinese supplies of fighter aircraft and missiles, and put together an invasion force, China would already have the bulk of these reservists prepared for combat. The only recourse for the US would be to use nuclear weapons to prevent its forces from being completely overwhelmed by massive numbers of Chinese infantry, tanks, and armored vehicles. Without the very liberal use of nuclear weapons, a US invasion of China is simply impossible. Now go check out Could Russia's Massive Artillery Force Crush NATO in a War? Or click this other video instead.